I am delighted today to introduce our speaker today, Monica Eppinger, who's going to be speaking to us about the Ukraine. In particular, her talk is titled "Outlook from the Precipice: The Future of Ukraine and the European Project." Monica Eppinger is an anthropologist and legal scholar specializing in Ukraine with a very distinguished and very credentialed CV. She has a PhD in anthropology of law from UC Berkeley, a JD from Yale Law School, and a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. And currently she's a faculty at St. Louis University, where she also serves as the co-director of the Center for International and Comparative Law. But before this already quite distinguished academic career, Dr. Eppinger was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, and she spent time at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev from 1995 to 1997. And so she remained involved in Ukrainian affairs during her subsequent tours of duty in the diplomatic service, as well as in academia. And apparently she left government service and entered academia in order to take up a more in-depth research on Ukraine and on some of the issues I think that emerged in her diplomatic work. And maybe she'd field some questions about that too, if people have any. Dr. Eppinger has a very large and distinguished body of publications, and I think we'll be posting some of them into the chat after the talk for those who are interested in looking at them. And before I turn over the floor, though, to our speaker, I'd just like to let you know of some of our upcoming events at the EU Center. So on Monday, March 21st, from 5 to 6 p.m. at the Boone Recital Hall, we'll be having Christina Schneider, professor and Jean Monnet Chair at the University of California in San Diego, who will be giving a talk entitled "Legitimacy Crisis, Government Responsiveness, and the Future of European Integration." Also, I'd like to remind everybody that Thursday and Friday, April 7th and 8th, we'll be holding our 20th undergraduate research conference on the European Union. And so we'll be releasing our full program shortly, but so we urge you to kind of stay tuned at what is one of our flagship events. All right, so without further ado though, Dr. Monica Eppinger. Big round of Zoom applause.
Thank you so much, Professor Tazara, and thank you, Ms. Lazorchik, and to the European Union Center at Scripps. I'm delighted to be with you today, and I'd like to just use a few slides to assist in my discussion. I'll try to reserve time at the end for questions, so I welcome questions. And my aim today is to try to give you a sense of the current situation or crisis in Ukraine, with a little bit of political history and cultural history from the point of view of a Ukrainian vision. So there are many, many, many Ukrainian visions. I do not pretend to represent them all, but I wanted to let you know that I'm not trying to give a US version of Ukrainian history, and I'm not trying to give a European version of Ukrainian history. I'm aiming to try to give you a sense of some of the ways that Ukrainians might tell the story of what got us to where we are today. So I'm going to share my screen and continue on, and just want to make sure I'm audible. Everybody's hearing me okay? Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Right, so slides are visible. Great. You can probably see I have a million tabs open because I'm trying to literally keep tabs on everything in Ukraine right now. But hopefully this will help to clarify things. So I'd like to draw your attention to 5 prominent years, 5 crucial years in the Ukrainian story of how Ukraine got to where we are today. The first such year is 1991. 1991, December 1991, the Ukrainian populace held a referendum on whether or not to stay in the Soviet Union. And independence won in a landslide with more than 92% of the vote. And just to give you a sense, I bought this map that you can see behind you. I trust right now my view of the audience is blocking my slide, but you guys can see this map, correct? Yeah, okay. So this map is a map that I bought in 1986 in Moscow, the first time that I traveled to the region. This was what the world looked like when I was in college. The Soviet Union was this big orange country. It was 11 time zones wide. If you think that the Earth has 24 time zones, in its width, it spanned nearly half the Earth. And Ukraine is this little part right here, closest to Europe. So 13 republics. In December 1991, Ukrainians held a referendum on whether to stay as part of the Soviet Union. They voted themselves independence, and 3 weeks later, Premier Gorbachev dissolved the USSR as a political entity. It seems clear that the decision makers in Moscow did not think that the Soviet Union made sense as a project without Ukraine part of it. There were other independence movements in the Baltics and in other areas, and they also played an important role, but in its own way, Ukraine's decision to secede from the Soviet Union, or the Ukrainian public's decision to secede from the Soviet Union, gave a special impetus. It's like the Soviet Union didn't make sense without Ukraine, in the view of Moscow. And I think that that vision is something that could inform our understanding of what's going on now. The second year that I'd like to bring to your attention is 1994, when the Soviet Union broke up. So again, this is our map. Here's Ukraine after independence. Russia is on that side. Poland is here. Belarus is here. Romania here. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, Czechia. You can see Europe here. All right. So 1991 to 1994, Ukraine is dealing with the dilemmas of independence. One of its dilemmas was when the Soviet Union broke up, it inherited part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. Other countries besides Russia inherited Soviet nuclear weapons on their soil, but most of them did not have, there were three others that did not have as numerous a stockpile as Ukraine had on its territory. So Ukraine inherited what we could really refer to as a stockpile of nuclear weapons. Most of the Soviet nuclear weapons that were aimed at us here in the United States were on the territory of Ukraine. It was a foreign policy goal of the United States to try to persuade the Ukrainians to commit to nuclear disarmament. And luckily for US policymakers, the Ukrainian decision makers in security had already been thinking in that direction. And their idea was twofold. One is that having nuclear weapons made the nuclear weapons vulnerable to being targeted for theft by criminal gangs or by terrorist groups. So there was a risk to everyone if a single nuclear warhead fell into the wrong hands and the nuclear material could be used to build dirty bombs or something. More broadly, in geostrategic terms, Ukrainian decision makers had come to the conclusion that they were never going to launch an offensive war. They were never going to be the ones to try to acquire territory by force. They had no interest. Ukraine did not see itself as having an imperial history or an imperial identity. It was not an expansionist state. It wanted its borders exactly where they were, no more, no less. And if it was never going to launch an offensive war, then the fear was that having nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory would make Ukraine a target for other offensive powers. That having nuclear weapons would paint a big bullseye on Ukraine if any other aggressive party ever did go to war. One of its first moves would be to try to pre-bomb the other states that might have nuclear weapons. And so Ukraine decided it doesn't, the logic of mutual deterrence that had governed the Cold War didn't apply to Ukraine because Ukraine never intended to use its weapons. It never intended to go on offensive war. And so it entered into negotiations with three nuclear armed states, Russia, the US, and the UK. And together, these four parties, Russia, the US, the UK, and Ukraine, entered into an agreement that was memorialized in an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum. And together they came to a security agreement. Each of those parties, US, UK, Russia, pledged never to use force to interfere with Ukraine's territorial integrity or political independence. So that Budapest memorandum, as you can imagine, is the subject of some discussion in Ukrainian circles these days. What did it oblige us, for example, to do under the security arrangement? In what ways might Russia have already violated this? Should Ukraine have given up its nuclear weapons in the first place? For anyone who is interested in the global cause of nuclear disarmament, what happens with Ukraine right now is really important, because any other country that has nuclear weapons that might consider someday giving them up is going to look at Ukraine's fate. Should they or should they not have? So this is a very important question for Ukraine, but also for the rest of us outside of Ukraine. Next year that I wanted to bring to your attention is the year of 2004. This was a year in which we see Ukraine becoming an object of specific interest from the Russian government. Specifically, Ukraine had had one elected president who had been elected 2 times since independence, and then this was President Kuchma, and he was term limited, and so they were going to have a presidential election in 2004. And in 2004, it was the first time that there was really clear national intervention by the government of Russia in Ukrainian political affairs. The Russian government, and specifically President Putin, had a preferred candidate. Their preferred candidate's name was Viktor Yanukovych. The opposition candidate, the guy who was opposing Yanukovych, was poisoned. He survived kind of miraculously. There was great pressures put on in the pre-electoral campaign. There was media takeovers. There were very crude measures to put pressure on people to vote for Yanukovych. I'll give you one example. A friend of mine who was in college in Sumy Oblast, which Sumy has become known to people who are following the war. It's in northern Ukraine near the border with Russia. A friend who was in college at the time, their dean, their equivalent of their dean, their rector, called them in to a meeting of all of the students, the whole student body, and told them all that they knew who they were expected to vote for, that the university was going to keep tabs on who voted for whom. And if you wanted to keep your scholarship or even keep your place in the university, if you knew what was good for you, you would know who to vote for. So repeat that across the country. There were very heavy-handed tactics to try to rig the election. On election day, there was ballot box stuffing, election monitors thrown out of windows. There's a million stories about how that election, there was attempts to manipulate the outcome of that election. The Ukrainian population saw through the election manipulation. They did not accept the purported results of the election. They took to the streets in protest, in a protest movement called the Orange Revolution. And after 6 weeks of protesting after election day, the Ukrainian political class came to a political settlement of the Orange Revolution. And the settlement was, we're going to rerun the election with, as a free and fair election. We're going to have election monitors, including international monitors, and we're going to do this clean. And when they reran the election, the opposition candidate was elected. His name was Yushchenko. So the Orange Revolution was a high water mark in the visibility of Russian interest in Ukrainian political leadership and an attempt to manipulate the outcome of an election. Just to give you a sense of what happened later, a little epilogue, in 2010, the guy who lost in 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, was elected president of Ukraine in a free and fair election. So there was, the opposition candidate had been elected in 2004. There was disenchantment with him, and the Russia preferred candidate Yanukovych was elected in 2010. I want to point out, for those of you who are interested in the European Union, that President Yanukovych continued the same policy towards Europe as every previous Ukrainian president. Every single president of Ukraine since independence in 1991 had one policy, and that was economic integration with Europe. and an aim of joining the European Union as a member state. Yanukovych, although he was Russia's preferred candidate, he stuck with that policy goal. And this was not a simple, straightforward thumbs up, thumbs down vote from the European Union about whether or not to admit Ukraine as a member state. There are a lot of really seemingly petty changes and adaptations that have to be made throughout the economy. And some of you may be experts in this, some of you may be well informed about this, but just to give a few examples, Ukraine is a big producer of agricultural products. If you want to sell your agricultural products in Europe, you need, as a member state, you need to make sure that your labeling fits the labeling requirements of European Union products. If you're going to sell milk products, there's a certain inspection regime for milk. How many times does it have to be inspected, for what kinds of qualities, and how do those qualities get dealt with? What kinds of processing are acceptable or not? Bottling requirements, weights and measures, all of those seemingly petty details have to be agreed upon in advance, and Ukraine was going to have to switch from Soviet standards, for example, Soviet milk bottling facilities and Soviet milk bottling processes, to European procedures and European standards. So there was a lot of details to work out. And the Ukrainians worked out a checklist with the European Union. The checklist they called the accession agreement. This was, if both sides signed the accession agreement, it didn't mean that Ukraine was a member of the European Union. It means that the Ukrainians and the Europeans agreed on a common checklist of what Ukraine would need to do before it could expect to apply to the European Union with any success. So that accession agreement was something that President Yanukovych continued to pursue. And this shows you a picture of President Yanukovych and the person who was his campaign manager since 2006, a guy named Paul Manafort, who later showed up in American politics. So I just wanted to flag that personage for you. November 28th of 2013, Yanukovych was supposed to fly to the Baltics to sign the accession agreement. The weekend before he was supposed to fly to the Baltics to sign the accession agreement with the EU, he was summoned to Moscow, invited to Moscow. He went to Moscow, had talks through the whole weekend. And when he came back, he held a press conference and announced that Ukraine was pulling out of the accession agreement, and he was announcing a complete U-turn on Ukraine's policy towards European integration. That European integration was no longer the aim of the European government. And I've argued in one of my publications that during the Cold War, for Ukrainians, Europe was a place. It was like over there on the other side of the Iron Curtain. But after independence in 1991, Europe was not only a place to Ukrainians, Europe became a time period, specifically the future. Europe was where we were going with our reform policies. Europe was where we were going with our intentions about the future. When we imagined ourselves part of Europe. Again, I don't want to paint all 42 million Ukrainians the same way, but in terms of government policy, Europe had become a destination in time. It was the future. It wasn't just a place that was over there. And when Yanukovych announced this U-turn on European integration, it was a little bit like the Ukrainian government had decided to renounce its own future in terms of how it had couched or framed its policy proposals and all of its aspirations. So November 22nd, Yanukovych announces the U-turn on European integration. A journalist goes down to the central square in Kyiv and tweets out, "Hey guys, I am not down with this. I think that this is not a great idea. I think we ought to protest against this." Some students came and joined him. And over the first 4 or 5 days, the protests were like people holding up signs and like honk if you love Europe, that kind of sign, down on the central square. And the number of protesters ranged from something like 12 to a couple of hundred. On the weekend, more protesters came to protest in favor of Europe, so people were holding signs. On the whole day Saturday, there were several hundred people, maybe as many as 500 or 600 on the central square protesting. And in the middle of the night, on the Saturday night after the reversal in Europe, Yanukovych talked to the chief of police in Kyiv, and they sent police forces to disperse the demonstrators by force. Since independence, Ukrainians had a proud tradition of street protest and street debate. It was not typical in Ukrainian politics to use force against demonstrators. So the night of Saturday night, force was used against the demonstrators to try to disperse them. When people woke up on Sunday morning to check Facebook or other social media to see what was going on down in the square, what they saw was students, college kids with bashed heads from billy clubs having been used against them, head wounds bleeding. And people decided, without a mass coordination, there was a very large sensibility that we are offended by a crackdown on demonstrations. So no matter how I feel about Europe, I definitely I'm not in favor of using violence against demonstrators. So this completely backfired on Yanukovych. And this is a picture taken the morning after the crackdown on the demonstrators. Instead of 500 or 600 demonstrators, these demonstrators go in all directions. There was something like 500,000 demonstrators. These protests became a movement. They occupied the central square. They didn't leave. They started to organize donations of firewood and foodstuffs. And this protests, the demonstrations snowballed in number. These protests became known as the Euromaidan. Maidan is the name of the central square where the protests were being held. Euromaidan signified that the primary aim of the protesters was to return to a course towards integration with the European Union. The second motivation for the Euromaidan protests, or the Euromaidan movement, was to oppose police brutality towards those exercising freedom of speech and assembly. And finally, the third major motivation for the Euromaidan protesters was to stop corruption associated with the Yanukovych administration and regime. There was a sense that corruption was becoming more widespread and more deeply entrenched. And there was a fear that if we don't nip this in the bud, we may never be able to get rid of Yanukovych through another free and fair election. Yanukovych seemed to get fed up with the protests. They started around November 30th. In the mass protests started around November 30th of 2013. They continued through December. They continued through January. Then in February, on February 19th, the order was given to use lethal force against the demonstrators to disperse the protests. And this use of force led to two outcomes. One was more than 100 people were killed. There were snipers on top of the buildings around the Maidan and shooting down at the Maidan. I'll go back one slide so you can imagine, if you're standing here, this would be a sniper's eye view. There were snipers looking down at the protesters and using fire against them. The demonstrators started to burn tires to try to produce black smoke to obscure them from the sniper bullets. And their thinking was, if we disperse, then we don't know if we're ever going to have another free election again. We need to keep the demonstrations going just to demonstrate that we want open political discourse in Ukraine and we want citizen participation. And so they held their position. Of course, many people fled, but there were enough people who held their position. So the first thing that happened starting February 19th was the use of lethal force against the demonstrators and the death of demonstrators. The second thing that happened was really astonishing. Members of Yanukovych's own political party started to publicly announce their repugnance of the lethal use of force. And members of his party in parliament would get up in front of television cameras and say, I am no longer a member of his political party. Within 2 days, he lost his parliamentary majority because so many of his own members of his party had withdrawn from the party. This led to a political crisis for Yanukovych. His own party was abandoning him. They reached an agreement to stop the protests and to stop the lethal use of force and to try to come to some new agreement on the political plane on February 21st. That same night, the lethal use of force stopped, and they held a mass funeral for those on the Maidan, on the central square, for those who had been killed. February 22nd, Saturday morning, the country awakes. Journalists go to Yanukovych's residence to try to shout questions, as they did every morning at his motorcade as he left his estate. And the gates were open, and the guards said, you can come on in, he's gone. And the journalists said, what do you mean he's gone? And they said, he left in the middle of the night. It turned out that from the night of Friday night into Saturday, Yanukovych fled the country and he left for Russia. So Yanukovych fled in the middle of the night, flees to Russia, where he has remained apparently until recently. He may still be in Russia. There have been reports in the last 2 weeks that he may be in Belarus right now. Paul Manafort, who had been Yanukovych's campaign manager since 2006, highly paid campaign manager, not clear where Yanukovych was getting the funding, widespread suspicion in Ukraine that the funding was coming from the government of Russia to pay this campaign manager. He disappeared from the scene. He's an American until he showed up in 2016, having been named campaign manager for Donald Trump. Anyone in the United States who was following Ukrainian politics in 2014 did not feel reassured to see Paul Manafort showing back up in the United States as a campaign manager here. People were walking through Yanukovych's residence. And this is an array of Bentleys and other luxury automobiles. The gates were opened, Ukrainians went through, it was treated kind of like a public museum of corruption. These are the kinds of images that were circulating on social media. And there was a general sense of exhale. It was a little bit like in The Wizard of Oz when the house falls on the witch and everyone sings ding dong, the witch is dead. There was a sense of, now we can relax, now we can exhale. Yanukovych has fled. That was an unexpected development, but now we can sort of start from scratch. Let's organize a new presidential election, and let's figure out where we go from here. That feeling of relaxation lasted for 5 days. 5 days later, I'm going to point you to this little section of Ukraine down here. That's the Crimean Peninsula. 5 days after Yanukovych fled, these people wearing matching uniforms but no insignia about country, rank, name, or any other identifying characteristics showed up on the Crimean Peninsula, across the Crimean Peninsula. And as it turned out, this was a plainclothes invasion of Crimea by Russian forces. And so just 5 days after Yanukovych fled, Crimea is overwhelmed with Russian troops. And 2 weeks later, there is a referendum at the point of a gun on Crimea, on the status of Crimea. Purportedly, the referendum was in favor of joining Russia. Russia's parliament subsequently passed legislation annexing Crimea, and Crimea has been occupied by Russia since then. There's reason to think that the referendum was not a free and fair exercise, and it's hard to find a Ukrainian who believes that that was a legitimate transfer of territory. About 3 weeks after that, over in southeastern Ukraine, the same kind of operation looked like it was starting. There was a town-by-town takeover of troops, unmarked troops in southeastern Ukraine. And since 2014, there has been a conflict running in these areas of southeastern Ukraine. There's one province called Luhansk and another province called Donetsk. And the orange area is the area that has been occupied since 2014 by these forces opposed to Kyiv. The Ukrainians, they had no president. Their Minister of Defense had also fled. Some of the top echelon officers in their military had fled. They were completely between governments in this interregnum period. That was when the Crimean annexation happened and when this Donetsk and Luhansk operation started. And it wasn't until April 13th that the Ukrainian government began what it called an anti-terrorism operation. They did not want to call it a war because they did not want to label themselves into a war with Russia. So they called it an anti-terrorism operation, and there's been a front here since 2014. So in our minds, we've been saying Ukraine has been attacked and at war for the last 2 weeks, but in the minds of Ukrainians, it would be common for Ukrainians to say, we have actually been at war since 2014. It hasn't been 2 weeks, it's been 8 years. The cost of what this kind of hybrid war that was not an all-out war, that was confined mostly to the Southeast, there have been more than 14,000 people killed. There have been more than 3 million people who have fled the Southeast to other parts of Ukraine. And potentially several tens of thousands also fled for Russia. Internal divisions grew sharper, hearts grew hardened. The economic effects of the occupation and the war was a contraction of the economy by 10%. There was continued Russian involvement with Ukrainian media and public discourse. But as a result of the events of 2014 and this Euromaidan movement, there was an acceleration of the integration relationship with the EU. The accession agreement that Yanukovych had done the U-turn on actually was signed in 2014 with the European Union, and there has been a steady progress towards more and more economic integration between Ukraine and Europe since then. Right now, exports to Europe, until the war started, exports to Europe accounted for 42% of all European or all Ukrainian exports, and that is a new development since 2014. Europe introduced visa-free travel for Ukrainians, so the integration of Ukraine and Europe has accelerated through the period of the war since 2014. In 2019, a man ran for president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and was elected on April 21st, 2019. Volodymyr Zelensky was seen by some in Ukraine as a pro-Russian candidate. He was born in Ukraine, went through university in Ukraine, but had spent much of his professional life in Russia. He had a television production company. He's famously known as a comedian. He also produced sitcoms. In 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Zelensky left Moscow and moved back to Ukraine. He integrated his television company with the production companies of a national television channel. They produced a television show about a simple school teacher in a small town in Ukraine who is confronted with corruption, and facing corruption, he swears a blue streak. This is the premise for the TV show. This simple school teacher swears a blue streak at corruption, and his swearing is caught outside of his schoolroom by somebody with a cell phone, and that goes viral. And he is launched into politics. And by the end of the season of his television show, the guy, this simple school teacher who's the anti-corruption guy, is elected president. And 3 years later, Zelensky himself follows the plot line and is elected president. We can see other evidence of internal realignment. Famously, people simplistically will divide Ukraine. Ukraine has a river called the Dnipro, which runs through roughly the center of the country. It's something like the Mississippi River of Ukraine, dividing the country into east and west. And simplistically, people will say there's the Russian speaking east and the Ukrainian speaking west. Simplistically, people would say there's the pro-Russian east and the pro-European west. Political parties and elections had regional strengths that did look like a division of East and West, but I really want to challenge this Russian-speaking East versus Ukrainian-speaking West. Ukraine is a bilingual country. Something like 98% of the population is bilingual. It's the most bilingual country in Europe. It has a more bilingual population than Switzerland, which is famously trilingual. Most Ukrainians speak both Russian and Ukrainian. When I go to Ukraine, I'm more comfortable in Russian. I've studied it longer, but I also speak Ukrainian. Whatever language I speak is the language that people answer me in. That's what's considered polite in Ukraine. If someone speaks to me in Ukrainian, I speak to them back in Ukrainian. If they speak to me in Russian, I speak back in Russian. And most people understand both. But political participation and political policy inclinations had followed a bit of an East-West divide. For example, here's a map of the elections in 2014. The war had really united Ukrainian politics such that by the 2019 parliamentary elections, these gray areas are the areas that are occupied by Russia. So elections weren't capable of having elections being held there. There's this small rump area here and here that voted for one party, and nearly the rest of the country was in favor of Zelensky's party. So Zelensky himself won in a landslide. He won with 70% of the vote. And you can see that his political party also won in a landslide. The last time I was in Ukraine before COVID, this was the sense. There was a lot of optimism. This is a family that lives in a neighborhood called Obolon. I've included this photograph because a week ago Saturday, I woke up to footage of tanks, Russian tanks and Russian troop carriers rolling in front of their neighborhood in Kyiv. This is one of the students who was one of the first protesters on the Euromaidan, who was, I think she was in 2014, I think she was 19 years old. She was one of the original people who got the ball rolling on the Euromaidan protests. After the 2019 elections, she was called into service as a 24-year-old. She was asked to help the political parties draw up legislation, reform legislation that would help Ukraine with its European integration. So that was the sense of optimism in 2019. I've included this photograph because this is one of the villages where I do field research in northern Ukraine. It's up in Sumy Oblast. I just saw footage from the nearest small town to the village where I do research, and I won't name it. Actually, I'm not comfortable naming it, but I saw footage this morning that they're being smashed and the villagers are hiding in the root cellars. So that's the setup for where we are now. The points that I want for you to take away from this historical review. First is the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine engaged in its own nuclear disarmament in exchange for security guarantees. Second, I don't have to tell you guys this, but the big distinction between NATO and the EU, meaning that European integration with the EU and the European economy has been a 3-decade-long Ukrainian project. That is not the same as Ukraine trying to become a member of NATO. It seems as though the messaging from the Kremlin and from President Putin is every time Ukraine expresses interest in the EU, he equates that with membership in NATO. And that's a false equivalence. And third, taking us to the eve of the present invasion and Russia's war on Ukraine, President Putin announced that the reason for going into Ukraine was for denazification and demilitarization. We can unpack that a little bit if you're interested, but I just want to point out to you the fiction and the absurdity of these two terms. Denazification of a country, there's only 3 countries in the world, to my knowledge, outside of Israel that currently has elected a Jewish president. Ukraine is one of those. So the absurdity of carrying out denazification against a country with a Jewish president. Second, the absurdity of carrying out demilitarization of the only country in the world that has had a nuclear arsenal that voluntarily gave it up. So that brings us to February of 2024, and I'll just talk for a couple of minutes more and then we'll go to questions. February 24th, the war begins. On the eve of war, this was the relative combat strength. The conventional military strength was clearly advantage Russia, nuclear weapons advantage Russia, self-defense motivation. This slide is from a talk that I gave on January 26th, so a month before the invasion began, and I said self-defense motivation advantage Ukraine. It still was my prediction that if Putin wanted to take Kyiv, he would take it in 3 hours. That the border from Kyiv to the border with Belarus to the north is a 2.5-hour drive. I've driven it in a 1988 Volvo station wagon that was a really crappy car, and it only took 2.5 hours. So it's, you can imagine the driving time wherever you are. Think about how close that is. I had always thought, given the overwhelming conventional superiority of the Russian forces, that I shouldn't say superiority, but the overwhelming advantage in force and firepower. I had thought that if Putin wanted, he would take Kyiv in 3 hours. And I woke up on the morning of, they woke up on the morning of February 24th. It was a Thursday morning here because of the time difference. It was in St. Louis where I live. It was 5 minutes till 11 on Wednesday night. And I had the live cam of the Maidan streaming because the Biden administration had predicted that the invasion would start on Wednesday. So I was just watching the Maidan all day to see if it was okay. And it had been okay. And then at 5 minutes till 7 in the morning, air raid sirens went off. And at that moment, at 5 minutes till 7 in the morning Kyiv time, I would not have been surprised if the Russian force had taken Kyiv by the end of that day or by noon even. Clearly that did not happen. I just wanted to point out a couple of other areas of exposure. What kinds of considerations do European countries need to take into account besides the threat, the military threat, and the threat of being drawn into a war that no one wants? One point of exposure and one limitation on European countries' ability to support Ukraine is their energy supply profile. These are pipelines of Russian natural gas that supply Western Europe.
Right now.
And this shows you, the graphic on the side shows you the natural gas as a percentage of total energy consumption in any given country, and how much of that natural gas comes from Russia. So for example, in Austria, 19% of its total energy consumption is natural gas. 100% of that comes from Russia. Germany, 27% of its energy consumption is natural gas, and more than half of that comes from Russia. So you can see that, especially during the winter heating season, there was particular exposure of the European countries and limitations and constraints on their abilities to talk tough to Russia. In the 3 weeks that Russia was holding military exercises, so they had stationed their troops in Belarus and around the borders of Ukraine. Famously, they had more than 100,000 troops engaged in military exercises for 3 weeks. I'm going to go back up one slide. Just if Russia had never invaded Ukraine, just the threat from those exercises had so driven up energy prices in Western Europe that the expectation of excess profit to Gazprom, the Russian energy company, they were expected between January and April of this year, they were expected to reap an extra $72 billion with a B, $billion in profits that they would not have reaped if it hadn't been for those military exercises. That was if there was military exercises and no invasion. Now that there's an invasion, different story. This shows areas that are currently under threat from Russian troops, and the current outlook. We've seen the use of indiscriminate force against civilian populations, not everywhere, but certainly in several cities, including in a city called Mariupol down here, where I have friends that, if they are still alive, they've been hiding in a basement for 2 weeks. Same thing in the university city of Kharkiv. There's been indiscriminate use of force against civilian populations there. They've been under bombardment since a week ago, Monday. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city. If we assume that there is no diplomatic settlement, we would expect Russian advances toward major population centers in southern and eastern Ukraine imminently, and a continuing encirclement or attempt to encircle Kyiv. We also know that the Ukrainians have brought a case against Russia before the International Court of Justice, and we can talk more about that if it's of interest. Similarly, current outlook on this map shows the number of people who are fleeing Ukraine. The countries bordering Ukraine to the west have opened their borders. They are not requiring visas. They are not requiring special travel documents. And in the last 2 weeks, more than 2.3 million refugees have fled Ukraine. The previous record for refugee movements that, as recorded in world history, I think was 1.2 million in 1 year. That was 2015 with the Syria crisis. We've had nearly double that, 2.3 million in 2 weeks. This is not over. All of Europe is going to be taxed with the influx of Ukrainian refugees, as will the United States if we're smart. We would be lucky to have refugees from Ukraine. They would, at least in the city where I live, in St. Louis, we would benefit from a talent pool that a literate population like Ukraine would bring. Both of these slides look very grim, the advances, the refugee outflow, but I want to leave you with one last thought, and that is Tuesday and Wednesday, a very reputable polling service in Ukraine conducted a poll of Ukrainians, not of the refugees who have fled, but of Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine, asking them, how would you describe your present outlook, hope or hopeless? We have, sorry, I saw that slide and I got choked up. We have 91% voting for hope. So I'd like to wrap up on the note of hope and then take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. I guess that first a round of applause for that, that very insightful. Zoom applause is not as enthusiastic, I think, as it would be in person, but thank you for that. And that is a remarkable last slide. I think very different from the mood maybe prevailing outside Ukraine about what the situation is. I guess I just want to get us started. A number of people submitted, students submitted really excellent questions, and I guess I'll begin by summarizing one of them. Is what you see Putin's kind of maybe the hierarchy of Putin's aims and purposes in this intervention, and also how those purposes might change as a result as the conflict continues.
So I do not count myself among the Putinologists of the world, and I don't claim to have any particular insight into his mindset, and I tend to feel extremely skeptical if somebody does claim to know what he's thinking. As soon as somebody says Putin wants or Putin thinks, I think I don't actually know if you've talked to him lately. And I don't know if he would be candid if you had. So I can't speak to Putin's aims. I can say the one insight that I feel like I can assert about Putin's thinking is Putin gave a speech last summer in which he traced the history of Russians and Ukrainians back to a single source. And he consistently says in his public statements that there's no difference between Russians and Ukrainians. In this, I'm inclined to think that he believes his own line. He said that since at least 2004. I also, as an anthropologist, will say that I strongly beg to differ. I think that there is a very large difference between Ukrainians and Russians, even pro-Russian Ukrainians, of which there are pro-Russian Ukrainians. I am still in touch with my friends who are pro-Russian. I still know people who are under bombardment who are still pro-Russian and pro-Putin. even they do not think that there is an equivalence between Russians and Ukrainians. I have not found a Ukrainian who has said to me they think there's no difference. Putin consistently says there's no difference between Ukrainians and Russians. I think that that is why, he does not understand Ukrainians. He always gets Ukraine wrong. Ukrainians surprise him when he tries to rig the election in 2004 and there's protests against the election rigging. He was surprised. When he apparently instigated Yanukovych's reversal on Europe in 2014, clearly did not expect a protest movement. And then when there was use of force against the demonstrators, in Russia, the history of public demonstrations, maybe the current crisis will prove us wrong on this, but the history of demonstrations during the Putin era has been, if 500 people show up in the streets in Russia and the police come out and bonk 500 people over the head, the next day you get 25 or 50 people on the street. And in Ukraine, if there's 500 people on the street and you bonk 500 people over the head, the next day you get 500,000 people in the street. That is a significant difference that Putin does not understand about Ukraine or Ukrainians. So I think he gets Ukraine wrong. And then he tries to search for, why did things turn out differently than I expected? And then he looks for conspiracy theories, including with us. I think it's a source of some of his conspiracy theories about the United States' involvement in Ukraine. If only we were as purposeful and effective as he gives us credit for being, but we are not, or we have not been. So the one thing that I can say about from Putin's past record and statements is that he seems to equate Ukrainians and Russians. And I think that he gets that wrong. I saw a couple of other questions that Aga sent me in advance about Putin's exit strategy. If it's usually escalation, how far can we expect him to go? If it is usually escalation, for example, the treatment of the city of Aleppo in Syria, I think that the city of Mariupol has undergone similar treatment. It's a city of 300,000 people on the southern coast of Ukraine. I think they've gotten the Aleppo treatment. And I want to be really clear. There has been indiscriminate use of force against civilians in a couple of cities in Ukraine, but there has not been indiscriminate use of force everywhere against all civilians. The trains are still running from Kiev to Western Ukraine to evacuate people who want to evacuate. They could have blown up those trains. They have not. The major highway running from Kiev west to Poland has been basically a parking lot. A 5-hour drive takes more than 2 days right now. And that everyone sitting in those cars are sitting ducks. They could have all been massacred. They have not been. I don't want to overplay or underplay what has happened to Mariupol and Kharkiv and Sumy and Chernihiv and Irpin. There are places that have suffered unforgivable, devastating attacks on civilians. I don't want to in any way minimize those sacrifices and that suffering. At the same time, I do not want to say that everything has reached the bottom and it could never get worse, because it can. They are showing some restraint, and that restraint could end. So I don't want to take it for granted. How great is the possibility of World War III is another question that was submitted in advance. I hope it's low. I think that World War III, if we think about a World War III, it would involve nuclear weapons. And I think that one of the main reasons for the United States and NATO's heavy reliance on economic sanctions and not getting involved militarily has been to try to avoid an active shooting war with Russia. So I am hoping that World War III is far from our future, but I can't guarantee it. Another question that was submitted in advance, why the difference in coverage of the conflict in the US and Western Europe? And I actually don't know enough about the coverage in Western Europe outside of the UK, so someone else would have to answer that question. There were a few questions that were Europe specific. How best can other countries, especially those that are the EU member states, help support Ukraine? And what are the ramifications of Ukraine's bid for fast-track membership in the EU? Why does Ukraine think that this move will help now? I would refer on Ukrainian aspirations, I would refer back to the distinction between Europe being a place versus Europe being a time. For many Ukrainians, Europe signifies the future. So the sense is the faster that we can get to European integration, the faster that, this was before the war, the faster that we can achieve some economic stability, some stable trajectory, and we can rebuild on a different footing than we have in the past. It would kind of reset the framing for Ukrainians' continued development. At this point, I can only imagine that sympathies and public support for Ukraine is running so high that there must be more pressure on the European Union to continue that accelerated track. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done on that checklist before European Union membership for Ukraine. And there's some steps that couldn't be skipped even if there weren't a war. So I don't think it's tomorrow. I could be wrong on that. What other ways can countries, especially those that are EU member states, help support Ukraine? The biggest support right now is having the open borders, giving Ukrainians a safe space. In that slide that I showed you that showed 91% of Ukrainians feel hope. Also, a question in that same poll, people were asked, do you intend to stay in Ukraine, or if given the opportunity, would you emigrate? A huge majority, more than 80%, said, given the opportunity to immigrate, I wouldn't take it. The people who have fled Ukraine right now see themselves as temporarily being outside the country. This is different than some other refugee crises where people don't see a future in their home country. So at this point, supplying a safe refuge for Ukrainians who need to get to a safe space is a huge source of support that Europe can offer. And that's going to take the support of European governments, but also the citizens of European countries. It's going to take individual acts of kindness. It's going to have to take forbearance with floods of new people who are unfamiliar. It's going to take a lot of patience that's going to outlast the initial wave of sympathy. So there's going to take some fortitude and perseverance. And then the last questions that I got in advance were how to rebuild a nation devastated by war, and how will nuclear power or nuclear weapons factor into that rebuild? So the Russians have famously taken over, Russian forces have taken over 2 Ukrainian nuclear power plants, the Chernobyl power plant and the Zaporizhia power plant, Zaporizhia being the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And we're not sure what the intentions are. If the intentions are to hold the nuclear power plants as kind of a radioactive gun to the head of Ukraine or Europe, or if that was a preemptive measure to try to protect those power plants from becoming a nuclear catastrophe that could affect Russia as well. It's not clear what the intention was in taking over the power plants, but certainly if we think about the peaceful use of nuclear power, this is going to cause a huge rethink in the use of nuclear power. And there's some very interesting long-term anthropology on energy use in industrialized societies. And I would refer everyone to a document that was developed in the early 1980s by an anthropologist at UC Berkeley named Laura Nader. And the name of the report is Energy Choices for a Democratic Society. I think we should all be thinking about climate change and also oligarchy. How do our energy choices contribute to what I think are the 2 big crises of the day if there weren't a war in Ukraine? So I'll leave that answer, and I'd like to take any last question if anyone else would like to ask one last question.
If I may, I have a question. I'm curious if the European Union has undergone any institutional learning from the Syrian refugee crisis, and if they are more prepared for this crisis, and also if you think that the current willingness to accept Ukrainian refugees is going to be temporary, or is going to be something that they're just more generally accepted than Syrian refugees were.
So the Syrian refugee crisis coincided with a year of the refugee, right? There was a huge number of people fleeing Syria at the same time that there were people fleeing Afghanistan, and there were larger numbers than there had been in the past of people leaving sub-Saharan Africa, some of whom could only be called climate refugees. So in 2015, there was an influx of refugees, including Syrian refugees, but not exclusively Syrian refugees, that really taxed European policies and infrastructure, and in the minds of some analyses, really contributed to the growth of authoritarianism or the support for right-wing political parties and movements in Europe. The refugee crises in some ways taxed Europe's self-conception as open societies that are not racist or xenophobic. And in fact, there are some people in Ukraine who said, we were attacked in 2014. Crimea was annexed and Southeast Ukraine has been at war. In 2015, the attacks on Syria were a way of attacking Europe through Syria by Russia, creating a refugee crisis that would tax Europe's infrastructure. So Ukrainians were saying, we've been fighting this war alone since 2014, and you think that it's just our problem, but a war on Ukraine is a war on Europe, and now he's opened a new front in Syria. There are some Ukrainian analysts who believe that. And it remains to be seen how European governments will respond to the refugees coming in. What is clear is that they have not slammed the door shut, so they know that there are going to be floods of refugees. And the question is, how will the response fare? At this point, there's overwhelming support from individual Europeans and individual acts of kindness. And we're seeing both the limitless capacity for empathy, and we're also seeing the limits and constraints on individual action. There needs to be some more coordinated, large-scale measures, because individual acts of kindness are not going to be able to cope with 5 million refugees. So what I am hearing from friends in Ukraine, I have a close friend who decided not to evacuate Kyiv. And one of the reasons that she decided not to evacuate Kyiv is because her neighbor had fled, taking a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old. They made it across Ukraine, which took a couple days for a trip that usually takes 7 hours. They got across the border into Poland. On the Polish side of the border, the neighbor was informing my friend who's back in Kyiv what's going on. And she said, people couldn't be nicer. We are offered tea and chocolate no less than 50 times a day, but we don't have any place to sleep. And my kids haven't been in school for 2 weeks and they need structure. So individual acts of kindness are amazing and overwhelming and really welcome, but individual warmth is not sufficient. So your question is a good one, and it remains to be seen how the member states and how the European Union itself will respond, if they can respond in a coordinated way. I think it's a key question, so thank you.
Thank you.
I think we can take one final question because we ran past the time already. So if there's anyone, please go ahead.
So
yes, go ahead.
I'm just putting a thanks in the chat, and I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who are watching now, to anyone who watches the recording later. I'm so thankful to Scripps for paying attention to Ukraine right now. I'm really grateful for the opportunity for us all together to get more educated, because this is going to reach the United States as well. And I'm so grateful for your focus and for your attention on Ukraine at a crucial moment. So thank you very much.